Hi guys, final chapter coming up, chapter 18. The farmer followed Bill out of the kitchen and Susan put her head down on the table and sobbed bitterly. "Now don't take on, dearie," said Mrs. Braithwaite, who never could bear the sight of tears. "We all know children will be children." "Scarecrows will be scarecrows too," said John boldly. Mrs. Braithwaite frowned at him and said, "Now don't talk silly. We'll let bygones be bygones. It's no use fretting. You go up to your rooms and have a nice lie down. You must be worn out with traipsing over the fields last night." "Can't we go for a walk?" sobbed Susan, who still hoped to rescue poor Hannah Harrow. "That you can't," said Mrs. Braithwaite. "Why, you haven't got a pair of boots fit to wear. They are all muddied up." The children saw that it was no use to argue. Besides, they really did feel terribly sleepy. "What about Hannah?" whispered Susan as they reached the top of the stairs. "Bill will have gone to the fields by now," said John. "He never makes bonfires in the morning." Then the children went to their own rooms and rested. Emily tiptoed into their rooms at dinner time, but Susan and John were sleeping so soundly that she had not the heart to disturb them. At 3 o'clock, Susan opened her eyes. Then she sniffed once or twice. The room was full of the smell of smoke. She ran across to the window and looked down into the yard. Bill the ploughman had just set light to a bonfire, which he was stirring with a pitchfork. By the side of it, and looking rather thinner than before, lay Hannah Harrow. Susan rushed to the bedroom door and turned the handle. Whatever happened, she felt she must go down and save the little scarecrow. She tugged furiously at the door, but it would not open. Somebody had turned the key in the lock. She darted back to the window and looked out again. Bill was swinging Hannah Harrow by the head. "Don't!" screamed Susan, and she hammered on the window. Bill was startled by her voice, and he looked all round the yard. Hannah's sacking skirt was trailing in the mud, and poor Hannah's sawdust was fast trickling away. "Don't!" shouted Susan. Then she heard John crying, "Don't!" too. Poor Bill, who could not imagine where the voices came from, turned round and round in bewilderment. Then, still grasping Hannah's head, he stepped towards the blazing bonfire. But before he could swing his arm to throw the unfortunate little scarecrow, someone very large and fierce-looking stumped into the yard. "Gummidge!" shouted Susan delightedly. Gummidge waved his arms and advanced towards the terrified ploughman. Then he raised a knobbly fist and hit Bill hard in the face and snatched Hannah from him. Bill staggered and fell over his pitchfork. Then he rolled a little way. By the time he had stood up again and had rubbed his eyes, which were quite blinded by smoke, Gummidge had disappeared from his sight. But Susan, who could see over the wall, caught a glimpse of Gummidge and Earthy Mangold as they disappeared down the lane. Between them they carried Hannah Harrow. Her head was sagging sideways, but Susan noticed that she was smiling feebly. Then the door handle rattled, and Emily cried, "Why, whatever have you been and locked your door for?" "I didn't," shouted Susan. "It's locked from outside. I've been trying to get out." "Oh, so that's why you've been making such a noise," said Emily, and she turned the key and opened the door. "Come to think of it," she said, "I must have locked the door myself. I tiptoed in a little while back, but you were sleeping so soundly I didn't like to wake you." John's voice sounded from the next door room. "Hi, I'm locked in. I want to get out." "All right," called Emily. "I'm coming. Don't rattle the door to pieces. I never knew such a boy." As she was going out of the room, she turned to Susan. "I can't think what's coming over me," she said, "but I've got into a habit of locking doors lately. It's ever since the handle came off the larder door. You have to lock that if you want to keep the cat out." She scuttled away, leaving Susan to go down to the kitchen where John joined her. They were not able to ask each other any questions because Bill the ploughman was describing his adventure to Emily Goodenough and Mrs. Braithwaite. He was saying in a high voice, "And just as I was going to throw the scarecrow on the bonfire, a great lout of a man jumped out at me and knocked me silly. I lay on the ground for an hour or more." "Oh," whispered Susan, "what a story." "And when I came to," continued Bill, "when I came to, the other chap had gone, and so had the scarecrow." "Maybe you threw it onto the fire as you fell," suggested Emily Goodenough. "Maybe I did," agreed Bill. "My trousers were singed and my eyes were full of smoke, so I couldn't rightly see. I reckon that is what happened. I don't see why anyone should want to steal a scarecrow." "What did the other chap look like?" asked Emily. "He was a great fierce sort of fellow. He looked like—" Here Bill stopped speaking and scratched his head. "I know he put me in mind of someone. He looked for all the world like our old scarecrow from out of 10 Acre Field." "Well, I never did," exclaimed Mrs. Braithwaite as she wiped the flour from her arms. "I should have thought we'd have finished with scarecrows by now. The master's just setting up a new-fangled windmill scarer in 10 Acre. "Well, let's have tea now," said Emily. "I've all the packing to do afterwards. What about those scones you were baking?" Mrs. Braithwaite went to the oven and pulled out a tin full of the soda scones she made so beautifully. The last tea was quite a feast. There was a new cake and a jar of apple jelly, scones and queen cakes and brandy snaps. The farmer had recovered his temper. John and Susan were quite happy again now that they knew Hannah Harrow was safe and Emily was in her very best mood. Mrs. Braithwaite actually seemed sorry that they were going away, and even the farmer muttered that the place would be lost without them. It is strange how the grumpiest people turn pleasant when it is time to say goodbye. John and Susan felt partly glad and partly sorry. It would be exciting to go home again, to see their mother and father, their dog, the cat, and the canary. It would be lovely to sit once more in the fussy little train that puffed so slowly along the valley. It would be fun to rush into their own schoolroom and see if anything new had arrived in the house. All that would be lovely. But it was rather sad to think they could not see Scatterbrook again until the summer, when the hay would have made the hedges look quite short and stumpy, and when days would begin early and last till 10 o'clock. Neither of them wanted to think much about Scatterbrook in the summer, for where would Wurzel Gummidge be? After tea, when Emily went upstairs to pack, John and Susan followed the farmer out into the yard. They went to say goodbye to all the animals, to the cows and horses and hens and chickens. They stayed rather a long time with the old black sow, because they felt they had seen so little of her that they ought to make the most of the time. They had so many things to do that they did not remember Gummidge again until late that evening, as they sat over the kitchen fire, drinking bread and milk and roasting their faces in the firelight. Emily was finishing the packing, and the farmer and his wife were drowsing on either side of the fender. Susan was reminded of the queer evening she had spent alone in the kitchen on the night when Wurzel Gummidge had paid his first visit. "I wonder when we shall see him again," she whispered, and as she spoke, she heard the sound of creaky footsteps on the flags outside. "Look," said John, and he pointed to the window blind. There was a queer raggedy shadow on it, the shadow of a head in a strangely shaped hat. Perched on top of it was something that might have been a rosette. Susan knew it was the tiny, fluffed-up body of Father Robin. A little tinkle sounded in the hearth as Mrs. Braithwaite dropped a knitting needle. She was asleep, and so was the farmer. John and Susan did not dare to stir. The blind became a blank again, and once more they heard the sound of footsteps, nearer to the door this time. The latch rattled, the door opened, and the farmer stirred in his sleep. Gummidge's face appeared in the doorway. He stepped into the kitchen. "Evening," he wheezed. "I've come to say goodbye. I'm leaving Scatterbrook." The farmer jerked his head and opened his eyes. "Why," he began, but even as he spoke, the door was shut. "I thought I saw a scarecrow looking at me," he mumbled. His remark awakened Mrs. Braithwaite. "You've got scarecrows on the brain," she said. Suddenly, Father Robin fluttered across the room. "How did that bird get here?" The farmer sounded puzzled. "The wind must have blown the door ajar," said his wife. "Unless the children—" But before she could finish her sentence, Susan rushed over to the window and caught Father Robin as he beat himself against the panes. His soft brown body quivered in her hand for a moment, and then he settled down into the hollow of her palm. "I do believe he knows me," she said. "Let me hold him," begged John. "Best put him out before the cat comes in," said Mrs. Braithwaite, and John opened the door. The robin flew out of Susan's hand and zigzagged away across the moonlit yard. The children thought that they saw two rather lumpy and raggedy figures walking through the yard gateway, but they couldn't be quite sure, for— "Come in," said Mrs. Braithwaite. "Come in and shut the door." That visit was the last one Wurzel Gummidge paid to the farm. But the children saw him again when they had left Scatterbrook some miles behind them. The fussy little train, which had been puffing like a green dragon between the woods and fields, suddenly came to a stop in a siding. It waited for so long that the children lowered the window and put their heads out. "Look!" cried Susan. She shouted so loudly that the elderly lady who had promised to look after the children on their journey to London dropped her book and little handbag. It was really rather lucky, because the bag opened and all sorts of oddments went rolling over the carriage floor. The elderly lady was so busy picking them up that she didn't notice what the children were doing. "Look, look, look!" yelled Susan, and she pointed to a small wedge-shaped field. In the middle of it, standing side by side, their clothes flapping busily in the wind, stood Wurzel Gummidge and Earthy Mangold. John nearly tumbled out of the window as he leaned forward to look. Gummidge's face was as knobbly as ever. His hat was battered, his clothes were shabby, but he beamed happily at Earthy Mangold. A few yards behind them stood Hannah Harrow. She was still thin, and she still sagged a little at the waist, but she too looked happy. Earthy Mangold raised her funny little face and smiled at the children as they waved their handkerchiefs. For a moment they were afraid that Gummidge would not see them. Then he raised a stiff arm and lifted his hat. A small brown thing whirled away from the brim and flew to the topmost branch of a silver birch sapling. Gummidge began to stump slowly towards the fence that bordered the railway siding. "Gummidge!" yelled John. "Darling Gummidge!" cried Susan. "We're going home to London." "Me and her's staying here for a bit," wheezed Gummidge, and he pointed to Earthy, who was hurrying towards the fence. "Why, we see a bit of life here, and the trains is company." "How's Hannah?" asked John. "Not as bad as she were. She's staying along of us as maid of all work." The train began to move slowly out of the siding. "When shall we see you again?" yelled Susan. "She's a fancy for London," shouted Gummidge. "She's daft to see the shops." The train began to move more quickly. "Come and see us soon," begged John. "Why?" came the reply. As the train steamed away, the children leaned out of the window. Gummidge and Earthy continued to wave until a corner of the railway bank hid them from sight. "After all," said Susan contentedly, "after all, it would have been horrid to stay in Scatterbrook after Gummidge had left." "And horrider to leave Scatterbrook if Gummidge was still there," added John. "Besides, he says he'll come to London." The elderly lady crossed over to their side of the carriage and pulled up the window. Well, that's the end of this adventure of Wurzel Gummidge, but there are lots more. If you liked it, go and discover them for yourselves.